Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Out of Program podcast. My name is Mohammed. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Out of Program podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Jing Ouyang, a doctor, or possibly if he likes to be called an ex-doctor. He said a for ex-SHO, which I told him didn't make any sense. So we'll just stick with ex-doctor or doctor. One of the fellow co-hosts of the Out of Program podcast and also co-founder of Patchwork. So welcome, Jing. Thank you for joining us today. It's a bit of a dynamic duo, these first two podcasts, since you interviewed me last time and now you're being interviewed by me today. So we'll get straight into it. So we talked about my motivations last time to pursue medicines and career planning at the age of 16. What was it like for you? What motivated you to pursue medicine back when you were thinking of it back in secondary school?
Yeah, like racking my brain about it now, I don't think I gave it that great a thought. Like, I think with kind of many people, when they consider medical school, they have to do it at a really young age because, you have to get the work experience. You need to write the personal statement. You're making that decision when you're essentially like 15, off the back of maybe a good set of GCSE results. But for me, the options, they didn't feel like there were many options. I think the career advice that we got at school, certainly in my school, was not very comprehensive. It didn't feel like there were, much options to even consider. And certainly coming from the background that I came from, the cultural background that is, the options felt limited. It was either to become a engineer like my family. I come from a family of academic engineers, or medicine, or law, or possibly banking at a push. So it didn't feel like there was too great a choice. And I think for me, I ultimately settled on medicine because I liked the combination of the science and the application of that science, but also feeling that it was a bit of an art as well, like that clinical practice would involve human interaction that I thought I would enjoy.
Did you feel any pressure to go into medicine? Was it like kind of expected of you? I know you said the big holy trinity of medicine, engineering, or in your case, banking or like economics, but did you feel pressured into going down one of these routes?
I think there was probably a subconscious pressure. Like, whilst my parents didn't push me in any particular direction, we were part of a community where there were a lot of my fellow peers who were going on to do medicine at prestigious universities. So I think that applied a lot of soft pressure. I think actually to flip that question, there were a lot of things that my parents didn't want me to do because they didn't feel like there were, viable career paths or paths that they understood. And I think it comes from their kind of immigrant background. So they're first generation immigrants, as am I. They didn't want, having taken a big risk in their own lives, to move from China to the UK and rebuild their lives from scratch. They didn't really want me to be making any kind of curveball career decisions. They ultimately wanted me to be safe. And I think that was a theme that you also mentioned, when we last spoke, that I think safety and making sure that the next generation are well set was probably a motivating factor.
So you had this at home in terms of career advice coming from your parents saying the big three. Was there a similar thing going on at school, or was it like totally opposite where they were more like, it's up to you, whatever you're good at? Because one thing I want the audience to know is we both were secondary school in Liverpool, but you went to a school just down the road, which was known for kind of having a conveyor belt of medics, especially going into like Oxford or Imperial, Cambridge. So was the same type of narrative at home being reinforced at school, or was there a lot more options?
So I think school was quite aligned to parental thinking. So in my school, it was a grammar school. It prided itself on getting students into the top universities and into the top subjects. So in the prospectus, they will talk about the number of students that get into medicine. So inevitably, if you express an interest in medicine, that's a subject that the school understood. And so would encourage, offer some extracurriculars, would offer some career guidance. But anything outside of the conventional subjects, they were completely out of their depth.
Were you tinkering at the time with anything? Like, were you just messing around with anything, or did you not really bother because you were so like, okay, dead set on getting those A's or GCSEs, whatever you needed?
Well, funnily enough, I did pursue other things. Even before secondary school, I took to coding at quite a young age. Actually, in primary school, would you believe? And
Okay.
unfortunately, my trajectory didn't end up becoming
wow.
like, one of the Silicon Valley greats.
Microsoft founder.
Yeah, but I remember after school, I would go to my dad's office and he was still working. So I would just fiddle around with the computer and I started coding websites. And I do reflect on that. And I think, had
Nice.
I had the right encouragement or support system like they do in Silicon Valley, maybe I could have, developed into quite an impressive software engineer. But, whilst I wasn't discouraged from doing it, it was seen very much as like a hobby that didn't have any, much of a career trajectory. But I was always interested in coding, and even in secondary school, myself and a friend coded a website where we made a bit of ad revenue. But again, it was seen as, it was called Hotwired. Basically, we just loaded a bunch of Flash games onto a website that bypassed the school firewall because there were no keywords in it. Very popular. Generated a bit of money from Ask Jeeves, if you remember the search engine Ask Jeeves.
Yeah.
Wow. But again, never really thought of that as a career. Never really thought about coding or computer science, as a real viable subject. But I reflect back and I think that was actually fairly viable. But at the time, it only felt like one of the traditional subjects was the path for me.
So you've now buckled in for the difficulties that is getting into medical school. You now are in medical school. What was the transition like into medical school? Because you have a very unique story, which I won't spoil, but I'll let you share that one. What was it like transitioning into medical school? Was it once again, now there was another emphasis on you being the academic Dr. Ouyang in training, or did you start to tinker more when you got into medical school?
So I think it's first worth saying that, at secondary school, I was a straight A student. I smashed my GCSEs. I did fairly well in my A levels. And so it was in the stars that, I would apply to Oxbridge, and I chose Oxford on probably very superficial, factors, like which city I preferred or which kind of college I liked. And yes, I interviewed at Oxford at Brasenose College for medicine, and I was fortunate enough to get a place. But I think this is where things started not to go to plan for me, as it were, because I really struggled to make the transition from being a top student at secondary school into an Oxford student. And I think it's worth mentioning for the audience that medicine in Oxbridge, well, in my case, Oxford, is very different to that in other universities. So, Mohammed, when we spoke last time, you talked about problem-based learning, which is a style of teaching for medicine. In Oxford, as you can imagine, it was very academic. It was all built around the tutorial system. So you'd have these small classes where you deep dived into subjects. You wrote essays on top of your lectures and on top of your exams. I really struggled to make that transition. And I think reflecting on that time, I think it was because I'd spent a lot of my time in school memorizing things, rote learning. And when I was actually challenged to think for myself, God, I really struggled. And so I wasn't an amazing student during my time in Oxford. And the other thing worth mentioning about Oxbridge is that they split their degree. So it's a 6-year degree, and you actually get 2 degrees from your time in Oxford. There's a 3-year undergraduate, a Bachelor of Arts, and then the next 3 years is your clinical training, where you get an MBBS. So in other universities, you may have the option to intercalate. and have that second degree.
Yeah.
In Oxford, when you pretty much just sign up for that intercalation straight off the bat. Now, the other thing about Oxford, which I think has changed now, is that there weren't enough clinical places for all the undergraduates. So it was actually a
Yeah.
competitive process to get into the clinical school. And unfortunately for me, because I wasn't a fantastic medical student at undergraduate, failed a couple of exams, always kind of scraped by, I didn't get a place at clinical school. And that was really devastating for me. It was my first taste of failure. And I'll be honest, I really struggled. That was a real kind of identity crisis for me.
So in terms of, I remember when we would meet up, like during Christmas or summer, you tell me about your essays, and I'd always be so confused because it was such a like 180 from where I was doing. I was learning anatomy of this and that, and you're like, oh, I have to write an essay on the mitochondrial function and its evolution. I was like, okay, that's ridiculous. Now, you mentioned your identity crisis where you came, I remember you being like a top candidate or top school student back in A-levels to now struggling and just getting by. What did that like teach you about yourself though? Like, what did it like help you learn about yourself?
Well, I think firstly, it was really character building. And I think this will be, and I do think that a lot of medical students will feel like this because they've come from backgrounds where they had to get the highest grades to get into the subject. And then that adaptation can be a struggle. You and I know of friends who got into university to study medicine and then failed their year and had to, retake their year, or they didn't get into their medical school the first round of applications. And it's devastating because you have to make the choice really young and you build it up in your head. And then, when you get into more of the real world, suddenly things aren't as perfect as you imagine. So I think for me, like I had to do a lot of soul searching. I had to, when I talk about my identity, like I said, I viewed myself as a straight A academic. I had aspirations to become a consultant cardiologist / professor of cardiology or whatever it was. I had to rethink all of that. And I had to look long and hard into myself to think, well, if I'm not a strong academic, then what am I? And I think that set me off on that trajectory to pursuing business and other ventures and exploring different things. It took a shock to the system, as I had experienced, in order to really refocus and replan my life.
Yeah, I think that really resonates with the whole theme of the Out of Program podcast. It's not you have to go like on an official Out of Program path, or you don't have to wait till you're like finish medical school. A lot of people will start to go out of program in medical school where they have these type of thoughts like, okay, I'm not enjoying the clinical as much as I thought, or I'm not as strong as I thought I would be academically. So what am I going to do with the skills I'm accumulating? So you've gone through this process, Jing, in the first 3 years of Oxford. You said, unfortunately, or fortunately, it's whatever, you weren't able to stay in Oxford for clinical. So what happened then?
So what ended up happening next was I needed to apply to other medical schools, and Oxford has a relationship with the London medical schools. So I ended up re-interviewing for my clinical place, and I got a position in Imperial, which is another, highly prestigious university. But this was a real culture shock. Whereas I liken Oxford to being a bit of a village full of effortlessly brilliant people, Imperial is in the heart of London. It is very different. The mindset of the students, the way teaching is delivered, the extracurriculars that the students get into is quite different. And what I found was that the students in Imperial were hustlers. And that was my first exposure to that as a concept. These students were, pursuing things that were enriching their CVs. They were, pursuing other projects. They were getting really involved in research and technology and in business as well. And they were really trying to make it in the world. And I do think that maybe this is because it's in the heart of London, and Londoners, I think, are just very different to the rest of the country. But also, I think it's a bigger medical school. So whilst Oxford had only, I think, 150, Imperial had 400 medical students per year.
Jeez.
So it feels more competitive. And because of the way that your foundation year placements are decided through your position in the year, through the deciles, I think it drove a culture where people were constantly looking to see how they could beat their peers and also gain an edge. And so I was kind of sucked into that. And I realized that there's actually more to medicine than actually just studying the subject itself and the practice of it. That there are all these adjacent fields that you can start pursuing that can give you a niche. And certainly, as I mentioned, coming off the back of an underwhelming undergraduate when it came to academic performance, the idea of hustling and doing things on the side felt really appealing and felt like I could get back on top. And I think that's what Imperial taught me. And I think it set me on the right track when it came to entrepreneurial thinking. So my time at Imperial obviously came from the back of, something quite negative, but it really did. It was honestly the best thing that happened to me because it taught me all these things about, the hustle and about life.
Was there a reason you chose Imperial over the other London universities?
Honestly, no, again, very superficial choices. I think I applied to Imperial based on the rankings, the university rankings. And it was also a place that I'd explored at undergraduate and I'd attended the open days. So it felt familiar. That was honestly it. I think all the London medical schools are fantastic. So it would have made marginal difference. But like I said, it was fortunate to go to Imperial because I think it was one of the most driven and entrepreneurial environments I could have gone into.
So you're now at Imperial. You've gone from a very, as you said, academically minded, didactic Oxford environment. You're now in the hustle and bustle of London. Everyone is trying to one-up the other individual, make it the next SpaceX or whatever it was at the time, Amazon. What did you immediately start to gravitate towards when it comes to out-of-program initiatives in your undergraduate years?
So initially, like all medical students, I got involved in research. That was very popular in Imperial. There were some fourth years who had more publications than some of the postgrad PhD students, So that was really eye-opening. So I got into research. And whilst I enjoyed it, it was nice to have something on the side. It was very slow, very laborious. And because you're not skilled in things like statistics, you end up doing a lot of grunt work. I contributed to a lot of meta-analyses where you're just sitting through papers or doing some laborious data work. So that was my entry point. And what I realized was that academia and publications are rewarding, but they're slow. The feedback loop is very long. But the benefit of being in Imperial is that there's a lot of cross-collaboration with the business school and with the STEM subjects and with technology. So I started to do some digital health research, and it really slowly introduced me to the world of digital. And I realized that whilst initially the digital products were, were a sideline to the actual research, I started finding it more and more appealing, the idea of getting involved in digital, because it was fast. You could build things very quickly, and then off the back of that, deliver things at scale. And I think that's something that you also shared when we spoke about the idea of having maximal impact. And I started feeling it myself. I thought as an individual, as a medical student, and even going on to become a junior doctor, the impact that I could have was one-to-one, whereas in digital, you can have unlimited, in theory, unlimited reach. So that felt very appealing. So that was kind of my journey into the world of digital. And of course, you and I talked a little bit about our experience working on PodLearn. That was probably our first real entrepreneurial endeavor. And, there was a lot of naive optimism, a lot of beginner's mindset. We kind of went into it, and figured it all out. Found collaborators who built the software, found faculty, certainly in Imperial, that were very supportive. And I think, again, it's testament to Imperial, where they understand the mindset of the medical students, and they want to support that entrepreneurial thinking, because many of the clinicians and the academics are also pursuing a portfolio of ventures as well. And of course, outside of PodLearn, there was a myriad of other activities that I got involved in. I organized some incredibly prestigious conferences, did various different academic and student-based projects that were, all had varying degrees of success, but nothing really took off. And certainly not in the way that Patchwork later did. But I think through Sling and working with different groups, you learn how to balance your time, you learn how to work in teams, and you start, building that wisdom and that judgment that set me up well for the future ventures.
No, I think one of the recurring themes from my podcast where you interviewed me and this one today is this traditional currencies. I think that's the natural kind of place where all medical students start, the traditional currencies of education, publications, audits. And then they start to dip their toes into other things. Like I remember when you were telling me about some of the stuff you were doing, I was like, what's going on? Like, this is amazing. So we've talked about PodLearn, and we'll park that to the side. What other things do you remember? You mentioned you started going into digital health. What, project did you do in digital health that kind of made you think once again, okay, this is where I want to really go all in?
Well, there weren't any particular projects that I thought, well, actually, let me reframe. Everything that I got involved in, I was a pure optimist. I thought could be the next big thing, but I was spread very thin. And I think that was probably, some of your frustration working with me, in that we were doing so many different things, and I was doing even more things than you were. So then the amount of focus and the attention I gave to any individual project was limited. And reflecting back, having since started a business and scaled it, I realized that focus is so important. So there wasn't any one thing. I think that during my time, certainly at Imperial, I tried many different things, and they all taught me different lessons and gave me wisdom. But nothing, I certainly didn't discover the thing that I was going to work on for my career in my time at Imperial. What I did discover was the person who I would end up spending the next, 7 or 8 years with in Patchwork, which was Anas. We met through one of these projects. That's how we connected. And I think Anas and I found an affinity with each other because we were both quite different. Me having come from Oxford as a direct entry student into Imperial, him as a graduate medic, having had a completely different life and career in Canada. I think we connected on the basis that we wanted more than just a clinical career. We wanted to do, different things. And I think we found a chemistry having worked with each other. And funnily enough, one of the projects that we worked on was a global health magazine that became, moderately successful. But again, didn't find means to monetize it or make it sustainable. So it died a death. But I think that, during our time together, we learned how to work together. We understood each other, and that set us up really nicely to reconnect in the future, and to work on Patchwork together.
Okay, so you've done the project with Anas, you've been doing publications, several other things, which I remember. One thing that's quite unique for medicine is this concept of an elective. So for those of you that are maybe not from a medical background, it's where typically in your senior years, maybe just before you finish your undergraduate and get your medical degree, you're allowed to undertake a period of time, often in a health setting, which has kind of changed, I think, now for the current medical students, where you can either go what I did, which I went international. I went to a hospital in Brunei to kind of get exposure of healthcare abroad. What was your elective like, Jing? Because I think yours was a bit unorthodox at that time.
It was unorthodox and also, quite frankly, underwhelming. So whilst, I had two sets of friends now, those from Oxford and those from Imperial. Everyone did amazing things and went to exotic locations, like South Africa or Asia or South America. And they combined some nominal time spent in a hospital or in a healthcare setting, but ultimately use that time to, have the journey of a lifetime with close friends, traveling and backpacking. I didn't have any of that. I opted to do 2 internships. And they weren't even very structured internships, if I'm honest. One of them was I spent a couple of weeks in PwC in their healthcare department. And the second one was in NHS England in the strategy department, working with, the strategy team there. And I believe it was Professor Tony Young who actually, who's the National Clinical Director of Innovation, who put me in touch with people who, gave me these opportunities. And I suppose quick shout out to Tony, because I connected with him whilst I was a medical student. He clearly saw my kind of ambition and energy and really helped me in the early stages of my career. And yes, I believe he was the one who set me on the path for these kind of more corporate kind of internships. And they were interesting. It was interesting to look inside of these organizations. But to be honest, they weren't very structured. And I didn't have a huge amount of learning from them in terms of skills that I then took on to other organizations. I've just remembered, actually, that I also tried to get an unpaid internship at McKinsey. And I was rejected because I think the reason was my math skills weren't high enough. Can you imagine? So
So why did you so all your friends are going abroad, all to some very nice tropical areas under the pretense of work and elective. Once again, those of you not watching the video, I did that in inverted commas. But why did you choose those ones? Because there must have been a reason for not going with your friends and colleagues to some nice part of the world.
I think it goes back to kind of my journey through medical school, right? I knew that I was not very, I didn't feel like I was academically strong. Certainly the competition in both medical schools was very high. People were exceptionally hardworking. So I knew that that wasn't going to be my edge. And I was very anxious to be able to, go to a good deanery and get my first choice jobs. And I felt an anxiety because I felt like I was falling behind. And these kind of side hustles, if you call them, or, side projects, they were my way of trying to get back on even footing in the face of all this competition. And I felt like maybe I could make the investment today and that would set me up for, years down the line. And maybe, after my foundation year 2, which is the natural break point, I could then enjoy, a traveling experience. But for now, maybe it made sense to make that investment and make that sacrifice. I think that was my thought process at the time. And I think my reflection is, some experiences are rewarding and formative, and some aren't, or some may influence you in ways that you don't expect. I think in the case of my elective, I probably would have, on reflection, I probably should have just gone traveling. But who knows what kind of subconscious effect it had on me, spending time and being exposed to those organizations.
So can I ask, Jing, so during this you've made the transition into Imperial, you now got your 3 years of clinical. You're doing all these hustles, which I think we should rebrand it to going out of program. I think that's a nicer way of putting it. Were you trying to set yourself up to leave? Were you thinking mentally, consciously or subconsciously, I'm gearing myself up to exit at the point of getting my medical degree? Or was this belief or ambition of being a cardiologist, as you said, professor of cardiology, still on the cards?
At that point, no. At that point, certainly in medical school, I very much still wanted to continue being a doctor. And actually, my ideal route would have been to complete my clinical training, become a consultant, whilst also doing all these kind of side projects. Because I think there are lots of examples of that. There are many people who go on and become consultants, but then become professors, or go into NHS management, or go into policy. That, I think, is fairly well trodden. And at that point, I thought, certainly I could do it all. And to be honest, whilst my thinking around business only really developed, in the latter years, when I was a doctor, I did also think as well that maybe I could run a business whilst being all these many things. Okay. And then you end up doing them and you realize that actually there's not enough time in the day. And those are some of the trade-offs, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on. But certainly at that point, I was very much committed to medicine and being a doctor.
Yeah, no, I think this is a changing theme amongst the discussions we've seen online, that it's now becoming earlier and earlier that medical students are thinking of making that transition. For us, it was always foundation year 2, or maybe even during finish your training, then exit. But now we see people who do intercalations and don't come back because they get whatever type of exposure, in the McKinsey or PwC type of thing. So you've done your undergraduate years, you've got your MBBS and the degree from Oxford. You've now come to Liverpool as a academic foundation program, which I want to kind of tap into, because for those of you that are not boomers like me and Jing, we are now talking about the specialized foundation program, which is the new name for academic foundation program. So one thing I want to ask you, Jing, is why did you choose to pursue that? What was the thinking process behind picking a academic foundation program?
Yeah, so I think this was the strategy of my undergraduate really coming into fruition. Because as I mentioned, I wasn't academically strong, so I knew I wouldn't place well in the deciles. So I knew I needed alternative experiences that would give me an edge. And the academic foundation program was the manifestation of that. So I can't remember exactly where I placed, but I think I came in the 6th decile, so very middling. What that meant was that I would never get my first choice jobs. I would never get my first choice deaneries, potentially even. A lot of the Imperial medical students wanted to stay in Northwest London. At that point, just because of proximity, I also wanted to stay in Northwest London if I was applying to the regular foundation program. So I knew that I needed a different edge. And the academic foundation program gave me that. So I interviewed in 2 deaneries. One was in Liverpool, where my family was from, which felt like a really great option. And the other one was in Leicester, so LNR, because a lot of my friends were going there. And the academic foundation program in Liverpool was the academic endocrine pathway. And the one in Leicester was NHS management. I interviewed for both. I obviously have a lot to talk about when it comes to research and alternative experiences. The interviewers, because it's judged on different criteria, whilst they also need to check that you are competent clinically, they're also more interested in those extracurriculars. So that's when I was playing to my strengths. That's where I excelled. And actually reflecting on it as well, the Oxford interview process is very similar to that of the academic foundation process. They wanted to test your thinking. So whilst whilst we train, throughout medical school on things like multiple choice questions, that's how it was typically done. In the academic foundation program, they would actually interview, they would drill in on things like, I remember I was getting questions about diabetic ketoacidosis, for example. And that I think also played to my strengths. So, I mean, quite frankly, I played a blinder. Given the mediocrity that I had in medical school, I'd put some eggs in the basket of extracurricular side projects, and that really lent itself well to the AFP. And I got both places. I got a place in Leicester, I got a place in Liverpool, and ultimately I chose Liverpool to be close to family and also to be close to you, Mohammed.
Oh, of course, they worked out so well.
For sure.
It worked out fantastic. So you're now the academic foundation program, the big dog on the wards, walking around with your AFP badge. Now, what was it like? Because if we remember my podcast, the one where you interviewed me, there's always that itch. And it doesn't seem to ever get scratched. It just keeps growing or it changes. You definitely still had that itch. So what were you working on at that time? Or how did you navigate the requirements and commitments of being a foundation doctor now with also this like intellectual curiosity to kind of broaden your horizons?
So firstly, you talk about this itch. You're definitely right. When I got to becoming a junior doctor, I was even more empowered to pursue these alternative experiences out of program, as you will. Because, as I mentioned before, clearly it's a winning formula. Clearly, I managed to redeem myself, as it were. So I was really keen to continue and see how far it could go. I think the advantage that I had as well, at least how I perceived it, was that through the academic foundation program, I would have a great deal of time doing research. And I think, it's worth appreciating that clinical time is very different to research time. When you're on the wards, your priority has to be to the patients. You can't be, you certainly can't be doing alternative projects in that time. Certainly your mind is on the patients and on clinical practice. So the quality of time is very different. Whereas, when you're an academic, there is a bit more flexibility. So that was my thinking at the time. And also it happened to work out that I had a rotation in acute medicine. I had a rotation in A&E in my foundation year one. And there's a lot of out of hours shifts, a lot of on-call, a lot of weekends. And then because you're doing a lot of on-call time, you also get a lot of 0 days as well. Or rather, you have a lot of time in the working day, in the 9 to 5, to recover, as it were. And I found that it was easy to spend that time working on alternative projects whilst also being fully committed to clinical practice. So that worked out really nicely. So from a tactical perspective, from a day-to-day, week by week, it worked out quite nicely.
Yeah, I think one thing that, just to reiterate, is like segmentation of time. We all get the same amount of hours. It's just how we utilize them that differs. And I think anyone thinking of like these out-of-program initiatives really has to figure out their time management. It's like if you can't figure that out, whether you want to stay in medicine and do the grind or leave medicine and do the grind, it becomes very challenging. So now you're exploring the alternatives in the northwest of the UK compared to London. Was there any immediate things that you got hooked onto or projects that were like straight off the bat you were involved with?
Yeah, so when I moved back to the northwest, bearing in mind I'd already built somewhat of a network in London, I basically asked that network, what was going on in the northwest? Could they link me in to the medtech scene? And, through those connections, I was introduced to Liz Ashell-Payne, who is the CEO of Orca. They do reviews of digital health apps. And she was a huge door opener for me. She knew everyone and everyone. And she put me in touch with the Academic Health Science Network. She put me in touch with some of the centers of innovation across the Northwest. And that's where I also met Ian Hennessy, who was the clinical director of innovation at Alder Hey Children's Hospital. And he was just starting out with his innovation hub. So whilst there was less going on, admittedly, in the Northwest, there was also more opportunity to get involved because, quite frankly, there were less clinicians or medical students interested in innovation. And I think people like Liz Ashell-Payne, people like Ian Hennessy were instrumental in getting my career off the ground in the Northwest. And then later on, I would end up working with them, working for them on a variety of portfolio projects. And that was great.
So one thing I want to touch upon, Jing, is you mentioned that there obviously were differences between the Northwest innovation scene and London. I never got to explore that shift because I stayed in the Northwest. I think the furthest I explored was Wythenshawe, so clearly I am not that adventurous. But for you, you clearly made that shift. Is there a difference in culture? Is there a difference in approach between the two areas?
I think, and this is a subjective experience. It may not be completely representative of both regions, but from my perspective, I felt like there was way more going on in London. I think because it is, the financial capital of Europe, there's a lot more enterprise. There's a lot more industry relationships. The academics were very business orientated, and there was a huge interest and appetite amongst medics and medical students to get involved in these areas. Coming to the Northwest, there simply was just less activity, less kind of industry involvement. The ecosystem when it came to business and entrepreneurship was also far less developed. Now, of course, the Northwest has come a long way since then, but at the time, there was a real paucity in things going on. But that was also an opportunity in its own right, because as I mentioned, whilst there's less going on, there's then, more, you can really stand out more. So that was, I guess, the trade-off that I saw. And, when you compare the two different regions, this actually came into full effect when I was starting Patchwork, because at the time when Anas and I reconnected and were getting things off the ground, it was a real toss-up, I think, between starting something in the Northwest with a place like Alder Hey Children's Hospital versus, starting Patchwork in a place like Chelsea and Westminster. And ultimately, we chose to start it in Chelsea and Westminster in London because access to capital, because the trust were also, more willing to take a risk and work with a startup like our own. But it is something that I think about, and that's why I'm quite passionate about the healthcare innovation scene in the Northwest, because I think about others who may need to make that choice. And it's a real shame that, I ultimately relocated back to London, but it would have been nice if other healthcare innovators could stay in those regions and build the wealth and build the economy in their local region.
Oh, definitely. And I think before we get onto the seeds that eventually grew into Patchwork, one thing I want to touch upon is you're now in foundation year one. You're going through all these character building steps, both clinically as a doctor, not clinically, in terms of all these other additional opportunities out the program. One thing that you did, which is quite interesting, and I just want to intro it before you give us more information, was you took a break, which is quite unnatural in the foundation program, in between your first year and your second year. Can you tell the audience why you did that and what it was for?
Yeah. So firstly, I think this felt like, at the time, this felt like the biggest risk in my career. And as we all know, medical students and doctors are quite risk adverse. And it's not even that big a risk when you think about kind of the entrepreneurial leaps that others will make. You know, some people will quit their jobs, you know, completely relocate to pursue their dreams. I was simply taking some time out of program. Yes, you know, in an unorthodox manner between F1 and F2, and I could always just locum on the side. You know, the profession was always waiting for me. But at the time, it felt like a big risk because I was leaving the cohort that I basically started with and going and doing something completely different. So to talk a bit more about that opportunity, this was when I was a foundation year one. I received an email from the University of Liverpool because I was connected to the university through the academic foundation program. I received an email that talked about the Peter J. Milner Fellowship in Medical Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which is essentially one of the alumni of the University of Liverpool, a pharmaceutical executive and founder who'd moved across to California, who'd, you know, made his money, you know, seen a whole manner of success. They'd essentially sponsored a fellowship where they would pay for either a doctor or a medical student to come out and join him in California to be exposed to pharmaceutical startups, essentially. So it was very biotech, very pharma focused. I applied for this. Again, going back to my point about there being less people interested in innovation entrepreneurship, I evidently stood out because of my background, and I was selected. And what it meant was that I spent 3 months out in California shadowing Peter in the various different businesses that he was involved in. And this was really interesting because it was my first time actually living somewhere abroad and semi-working. So that was, again, another cultural shock. But I think in the context of out of program, taking 3 months out meant that I had to actually take the full year out. Now, what I wanted to do was to replace my academic rotation with this experience. The academics were fine with it. The foundation program, less so. They struggled to accommodate this. There was a lot of prerequisite paperwork. There needed to be a supervisor who was onboarded. You know, a lot of those hurdles meant that it wasn't possible. Everyone else was very accommodating. Peter was hugely accommodating, said, just come out whenever you want. The academics were like, okay, you don't want to work in the endocrine lab. That's fine. You can still be involved in the endocrine lab, but you can spend the bulk of your time elsewhere. It was the foundation school that was quite rigid. And I get it because it is something very left field. This was something that was not offered anywhere else. But it was something that I was trying to make work and I couldn't. So then I was confronted with the reality that I would need to take the full year out. And the foundation school said they would basically endeavor to keep my rotations when I came back. Now, when I did come back, that didn't happen. You know, my, the academic rotation that I was really banking on evaporated. And what ended up happening was I got all of the least desirables, shall we say, rotations, which meant it was quite brutal. So I ended up doing 2 rotations of A&E in my foundation year 1 and in my foundation year 2, which is a lot for a foundation doctor.
That's one is too much. One is too much.
Exactly.
So what was the experience like in this fellowship?
Yeah, well, it was really interesting. So it was basically all self-organized. So I had this pot of funding, and I basically organized myself, my accommodation, my flights. You know, Peter's commitment was that he would give me exposure to the businesses that he was involved in, which was really interesting, although there was a limit of what I could offer. You know, the people out there starting these businesses have have like, MBAs and PhDs and of course medical degrees as a prerequisite. So you can imagine someone like myself with no extensive, academic background, no experience in pharma. There was a limit to what I could do, but nevertheless, it was really interesting. And I ended up living in what they call a hacker house. So I was stuck with like 30 or 40 other people in this Airbnb where I was sharing a room with like 5 other people, with multiple rooms. And there were loads of people coming out to California from across America, actually from across the world, that were taking part in accelerators like Y Combinator or 500 Startups.
Yeah.
Or they just landed their first tech role in, like, say, a LinkedIn or a Facebook. And they'd moved out there to just spend a few months just getting their bearings before they'd actually, like, find more permanent accommodation in the Bay Area. So I think, honestly, I think that was one of the most interesting parts of the fellowship, just being exposed, socializing with those people. And many of them are, friends that I, have kept in touch with. And recently I was out in California, saw some people, which was really nice. And many of them have gone on to do really exciting things in the world of tech.
So no inkling for you to join one of those startups whilst you're out there as the medical advisor or the chief medical officer?
I was severely underqualified. If you think London is intense compared to Liverpool, can you imagine what Silicon Valley, what Mountain View, and what San Francisco is like compared to London?
Yeah.
So completely different ball game, but very eye-opening nonetheless.
So you've done the 3 months. You've now come back. You've got another 9 months to do whatever you want. What was on the to-do list for Jing back then?
So when I came back, as I mentioned, I'd been introduced to some really great people like Liz and like Ian. Because I had 9 months essentially, I locumed a little bit, but I was also offered roles by these people. So I took a medical advisory role with Orca through Liz, and Ian appointed me as a clinical fellow, and I eventually became the clinical lead for digital health at Alder Hey Innovation Hub.
Nice.
And Ian will always say that I was, one of the first clinical fellows. I think there were others at the time, but certainly it was in the early days of the Alder Hey Innovation Hub. So there was a lot of opportunity. It's also worth noting that because I was doing so many different things, whilst I was actually out in California, that was when the bones for Patchwork started to be formed. Because prior to going out on the fellowship, I'd organized a conference in London around ophthalmology innovation. So again, something really random, and one of the many things I was involved in. But because I was living in Liverpool and I was organizing it in London, I thought it was a really good opportunity to invite all the people that I'd worked with on innovations, at Imperial in the past, and just basically catch up with them. And one of those individuals that I invited was Anas. And we got talking, and it turns out that he was also planning to take some time out. He was doing a Darcy Fellowship. But we both needed to locum. And whilst I was in the Northwest, and he was at the time working in Kent, so in the Southeast, we found that our experiences and our frustrations of locuming in the NHS were very similar. Very paper-based at the time, very manual, and not done with the user experience of the clinician in mind. So we said to ourselves that very day from that conference, let's actually commit to doing this. I think this is something that has legs. And on top of that, both of us will have some time out of program to basically think, ideate, hustle, and see how far we get. So I was already thinking and doing a bit of planning around Patchwork when I was out in California, but this was very early days. By the time I got back to the UK, we'd started to put some wheels in motion. And certainly I was able to balance this because I wasn't clinically practicing. I was out of program, I could do the work with
Yeah.
Liz, I could work with Ian in Alder Hey, and also I could start exploring Patchwork on a more meaningful level. And it gradually just gained more and more steam as the months progressed.
So now you're at a point, a very interesting crossroads, which I'm sure a lot of other founders will be, where you've got an MVP, but now the horns of FY2 are beckoning you. And I remember having this discussion with you because I had gone straight into F2. I didn't have this break in between. I was speaking to you about it. And I remember you were very confused and uncertain. Do I come back? Do I finish my FY2 year? Because at this point, F1 is when you get your GMC registration. You are now a fully registered and qualified doctor. Now you've got a viable product, which you want to now try and get funding for and obviously start that. So what was that position like to be in? What was running through your mind? And what ultimately kind of pushed you into completing your FY2?
Yeah, this felt like a very tough choice at the time. And I was very torn because by that point, Patchwork had started gaining some steam, but I don't think we'd closed our seed round, for example. I think there were still many things that were up in the air. So it felt like a very big risk to take more time out of program when there wasn't a concrete thing to jump into. It felt very risky. Having said that, though, there were all these other opportunities because of Alder Hey, because of Orca. And you and I were still doing a variety of different things. We're working on, the nutrition project, Our Healthy Future. So there were a lot of opportunities, but nothing that was going to fully pay the bills, as it were. And ultimately, I chose to go back into my foundation program because I wanted to fully qualify, to get my full registration. And I felt like to take more time out between F1 and F2 felt so uncertain and felt very risky because people didn't really do that. So I already thought I was living on borrowed time.
Yeah.
It was ultimately a hedge. And I look back and I think maybe I actually didn't need to go back into foundation program. But ultimately, the decisions were made in the way that they were made. Things happened. Everything happens for a reason.
Yeah.
And Patchwork and everything in my career and life has panned out the way it has. So I certainly can't say it was a huge detriment. And maybe if I'd actually gone in to Patchwork and left foundation training, I would have, for example, needed to have been paid by Patchwork sooner than later, which may have put lots of pressure on the business at the time. And maybe the business wouldn't have been a success.
Yeah.
But by having a day job while still being able to work on things, albeit from a distance, maybe that was actually advantageous. It's speculation at the end of the day, but can't say I have huge regrets.
Yeah. So now you're in foundation year 2, you've got Patchwork growing and growing, gaining traction, gaining steam. What was it like? Because when we talked about it from my perspective, mine was different. Mine was all aligning with my career trajectory in terms of like radcast with radiology training. For yours is kind of very separate. So what was it like, especially now that your academic block, which is now evaporated, you've been thrown back into the thrusts of A&E where the rota is horrendous. How was it navigating the clinical commitments with a startup that is gaining traction day by day?
Yeah, so it was tough in many ways because the time demand was enormous. Like I said, I had the most undesirable rotations. And when I talk about it being undesirable, I meant that, these were rotations that had significant on-call and out-of-hours commitments, lots of night shifts. So it was physically exhausting, which made it difficult to balance. And I think, during that foundation year 2, as the business picked up more and more steam, there was tension between myself and Anas because he was then working full time and I was only able to contribute nominally or like in an ad hoc manner. Startups are hard enough as it is.
Yeah.
But if you can only dip in and out and only do things that are fractional or that don't require your full investment of time and energy, that's very tough. And whilst, it wasn't a huge tension, that tension did ultimately exist. And I think that, post F2, when I did fully commit to Patchwork, no lasting damage had been done, but it was very tough for Anas to be right at the beginning, working essentially alone with me as more of like as moral support.
An advisor type of thing,
as an advisor, as moral support, rather than being hands in getting my
a founder.
Basically essentially being a founder. Like that was quite tough. Now on the flip side of that, given those rotations were so brutal, funnily enough, I found it actually very rewarding to be able to work those hard shifts, but also to have this, what was essentially a side project to keep me energized, because it didn't matter after any of the long hours, I could re-energize myself thinking about, the promise and the opportunity of Patchwork. So, and I think that's my recommendation actually to people when they think about out-of-program experiences or side projects, that you would think that it would actually be draining, that it would actually take up more time, but actually it can sometimes be energizing, and they can be very synergistic. They can feed into each other and they can reward each other in quite a cyclical manner. So that was, I guess, the upside to it all.
No, I think there is something, even with these out-of-program podcasts that we are co-hosting, when you get into flow state, you don't feel tired. You feel really like focused, energized, and you're like, okay, and you want to keep going. But obviously, things, you finish the task at hand, but you want to keep going and going. So now we've got 3 points in your career to date. You didn't make the jump after medical school. You were continuing on to the foundation program. You made the year out in F1, in between F1 and F2, and you didn't make the exit. Now comes the end of your foundation year 2 program, where you do make the exit. So what was the difference at this point compared to the last 2 points?
I think it was just where Patchwork was as a business. So during that foundation year 2, we had raised money. We had, essentially properly incorporated. We'd hired employees. So it felt very real. And I was based in Liverpool, and Anas and the business were based in London. It wasn't even too much of a discussion. Like, I had to move down to London. I had to make it a success. I had to be where the business was. And I suppose the decision wasn't too hard because I'd studied in Imperial. We were working with Chelsea and Westminster, which was part of Northwest London Deanery. So the whole area felt very familiar. And I essentially just moved back to Shepherd Bush, where I'd been living as a medical student. So it didn't feel like too big a transition, actually. And at that point, I didn't know what the future held. As an early stage startup, there was still a lot of risk. Patchwork could always collapse. And then, of course, I would need to go back into clinical. But also as well, like, I hadn't designed my career with too deep a thought. Part of me thought maybe I could still be a clinician and still follow that dream of becoming a consultant and a professor. And it turns out a tech founder. But then as I moved to London and started working full time, the reality set in. Because I was the chief operating officer, I was responsible for all our client-facing activities, our implementations, our projects, our account management, our support function. For anyone who has ever had any experience of operations, it is enormously time-consuming. It's also emotionally draining as well. You're putting out fires all the time. So what ended up transpiring was that whilst, when I went back to Liverpool periodically, I would try and pick up the locum shift here and there. It became more and more unrealistic as the months and years went by. And ultimately, I needed to give it up. I still emotionally struggle with the idea of giving it up completely. So I still pay the GMC, the fees. No idea what I'm...
Oh, wow, you still pay?
Don't know what I'm paying for, but I assume to keep my name on the register. I certainly don't think I've got a license to practice.
But
yeah, like...
I hope not. I hope not.
But it's hard to let go, and the emotional connection is still there. I think that's the GMC is almost the tax I pay for that.
Yeah, keeping that identity. No, because one thing that I want to touch upon is, and there's a reason why we asked this at the beginning. Why did you do medicine? And obviously you mentioned parental influence. So what was that discussion like? Because your parents, well, I'm sure they're still proud of you, but at that time, you're an academic foundation program, you're an Oxford grad, you're an Imperial grad, you're like the creme de la creme. You're like, all right, in terms of showing off your kids at family gatherings, you're getting the throne. So when you had that discussion, did it feel like before you applied to medical school, where you're trying to explore careers, was there a lot of reservation? They're like, Jing, this is too risky. No, become the cardiologist.
There definitely was. I think that my parents didn't fully understand what it was I was doing. But they were supportive in their own right, in that they weren't discouraging. They knew what they wanted from me, which was they really valued academia. So there was always a subconscious kind of influence to pursue, to do a PhD and then to become an academic and ultimately to become a professor. Within our community, there were also people who had taken that path. So it was well understood, and importantly, it was very well respected. So they weren't discouraging. They expressed their preference for the things that they wanted me to achieve. And I think they indulged me on all these kind of projects. And, I would have many a debate at the dining table talking about, what exactly my game plan was, what I was doing. And they would challenge it from the lens of their own kind of cultural upbringing. But, and that was just a bit of toing and froing. When I ultimately made the decision to take time out of program to then go all in with Patchwork, I think even then they thought, well, you can always go back to, clinical practice. You can always go back to becoming that professor. And there could also be a world where you do all these things simultaneously. And to be fair, that is also how I thought about it as well, naively so. I think where the tipping point for them came was when Patchwork started to get press, when, we were being featured in national media, and when they started noticing the press releases about X amount of millions of pounds being raised. That was when they started paying attention and thought, God, maybe this isn't just some, nonsense that Jing is pursuing. Maybe this is actually something that's viable. But of course, as parents are, they will still ask me, when do you plan to go back and complete your training? Maybe you should do that PhD and become that professor eventually. Those questions still persist, but I think at least now they appreciate what I am doing. And in true kind of Asian upbringing fashion, they'll never express pride. They'll never say, I'm proud of you. But I think deep down, look.
Well done.
But I think deep down, they think I've done all right.
Well, so one thing I want to ask you, Jing, we talked about having this discussion with your parents and, of course, them kind of acting as your first, soundboard of trying to get, immediate feedback as whether you should go all in, try to navigate it with a clinical career. But did you ever have this discussion with Anas, your fellow co-founder of Patchwork? Anas, I'm thinking, could I stay in clinical medicine? Is that a possibility? Was that ever discussed, or was it kind of presumed that both of you are now not only co-founders, but all 100% in?
It was not an active conversation that we had. I think it was presumed because of what we were experiencing at the time. So bear in mind that Anas and I were first-time co-founders. This was our first rodeo, and it was the first time that we'd raised external capital. So there was a pressure from investors and from ourselves to make this a success. So we were all in, and startups are hard enough as it is without you being fractional. So we wanted to make sure that we were giving it our all. I think the other thing as well is the practicalities of continuing clinical medicine were challenging as well. So myself and Anas continued to locum for a short while, but it was really clear that this was unrealistic. I had trained up in the Northwest, so bearing in mind I was familiar with the IT systems, with the protocols, with the cultural environment of how medicine was practiced. So whenever I went back to the Northwest, for example, to see family or friends, maybe I would pick up the odd shift here and there, but I was spending way too much time in between that I'd started losing some skills. I forgot how I even bleeped people, like, some of the basic administrative requirements. And that's when I realized that it was not getting safe. So for Anas, he ended up actually continuing a year later than I did, but he was able to balance that because he was locuming in Chelsea and Westminster, where we were implementing the product for the first time. So essentially, he was acting more like a secret shopper, and I think that worked out really nicely. But neither of us, I don't think, considered actually pursuing the training pathway. That was just not on the cards, given how high pressured and how volatile things were in the early days of Patchwork.
So now you've dived headfirst into Patchwork. Both of you are now giving it 100% of your time and effort. What was that transition like? Did it feel like water off a duck's back because of all the skills you had developed from other initiatives, both in undergraduate years, postgraduate years, or did it feel totally alien to you?
As an optimist, I really looked forward to it, and I went into everything with earnest and with excitement. So it didn't feel daunting. I think you're right in that, through the myriad of side projects, alternative experiences, I took all of those into my role at Patchwork, but it was still a very steep learning curve. And I think for me, the difference between being a doctor in the NHS and starting a business is when you're starting a business, it feels like it's all on you. Every decision, there are no right or wrong answers. Like the weight of accountability and the weight of responsibility is enormous. And that might feel weird talking about it in the context of comparison to medicine, because of course you're dealing with patient lives. But you have to remember that at my stage of training, I was doing a lot of protocol-driven decision-making, and I was also doing referrals, whether it's ward work or in A&E. You end up handing it off to a more senior specialist who ultimately makes the judgment call. So in medicine, whilst you are dealing with patients and with the lives of patients, it's a very safe and it's a very safe environment for a junior, and deliberately so, because it's patient outcomes. So they standardize it all. Whereas in the world of business, it's a wild west. You don't know if the decision is right or wrong. All you do know is that everyone depends on you and you're going to make payroll every month. So very different. And that was a very steep learning curve.
So one thing I want to ask you is, so you went into Oxford, there was the academic element. You then went to Imperial. There was once again the academic hustle, we'll call it that. You then had this idea of becoming a cardiologist, a professor of cardiology. Obviously, everyone has grass is greener mentality, but do you have that thought? What if? Could I still do it? Maybe I should. Is that still there? That thought? Do you feel like a doctor?
I think that thought now comes into my mind way more often than it did in the early years. But bearing in mind that I'm 7, 8
Oh,
years
wow.
in, I think you feel nostalgic. I always enjoyed clinical practice. I've hated the hierarchy, the bureaucracy of it all, but I really enjoyed spending time with patients and applying the science into the art, as it were, into the day to day. So I do miss that a little bit. It must be said.
But do you still feel like a doctor? If you get what I mean, like do you associate with the doctor cohort, or are you like, just that guy that walks in that meme where the guy's in the corner of the party and he's like, oh, they don't know I'm a doctor?
So that less so, and maybe that correlates with that feeling of nostalgia that I have, because I notice this, because now that I've spent 7, 8 years out of training, I notice that my knowledge is no longer up to date, and my time spent with fellow doctors. You know how doctors love to talk about their day-to-day, their clinical practice, all the obscure things that alienate all non-doctors. I'm finding myself drifting more and more into the alienated as a non-doctor camp and being out of my depth. And like, that is, it's, I'm consciously observing that and thinking, wow, that's really, really interesting. So how does that, I suppose, how does that relate to feeling like a doctor? I don't think I'm having an identity crisis, but I think the relevance to calling myself a doctor, becomes less and less. Ultimately, some things will still always exist, like time spent as a, senior house officer, the environment. Some things never change, the culture and the practice of working in a hospital. That's still an experience that I take into my day-to-day in Patchwork, when talking about implementation or talking about the product. But I think, the world has moved on so much more. The friends that I trained with, the friends that I went to medical school with, their experiences are now becoming more and more unrelatable. So there is that drift. But I don't think it's a huge identity crisis for me.
Just waiting. But what would you say your trade-offs are? Because when we discussed mine, staying in clinical training and then building the business around it, it's different to yours. So I'm really curious, like what when you look back and like think about it, what would you say your trade-offs and potential regrets, if any, are?
Well, I suppose we've talked a little bit about the loss of clinical practice, and that is, that can't be discounted. That is quite profound, because I did really enjoy that aspect of the job, and it is completely unique to the practice of doctors. And that's why, so many people romanticize the life of doctors. There's an endless fascination from the general public, or the reality TV of 24 Hours in A&E, or things like House or Grey's Anatomy. Like, there is a fascination. And I think that is something I resonated with. And ultimately, that's the thing I needed to give up. And when I think about that trade-off, it wasn't a conscious trade-off, because we talked about, did Anis and I have the discussion about staying in training versus going out? We didn't have that. It was just things that just drifted. The decisions were made by the actions and the decisions that we took in our outside ventures that meant that there was no path back into clinical practice. And every so often, certainly at this stage of the business, people will talk to me about, oh, what next after Patchwork? Could you go back into training? You could just, pick up a clinical post, right? And of course I could, but my life has moved on so much. Like, things have changed. Firstly, I'm completely unsafe. I would need to, essentially go back and do foundation training again. I've lost my license. I don't even know what it means to get my license back. The path back is possible. It's theoretically possible, but realistically, like, not achievable. And because, you've invested so much time into business, you're on a completely different career pathway. The route back in now is, I think, closed. Whereas I think for the people who manage to balance things alongside, the door always stays ajar to invest in one area over the other at any given point in their life. That, to me, is the biggest trade-off. And I think there are some general trade-offs with pursuing a startup because you do sacrifice some of your relationships because you're all in this role. Whereas with any other job, even medicine, there is a certain 9 to 5 in the sense that, when the shift ends, you ultimately, you can just leave it behind. I mean, I know some doctors struggle with that because they carry the work home with them more so than in any other profession. But generally, I find that it is achievable. Whereas when you're running your own business, that is not. And I think then, I talked about being unrelatable to other doctors. You also then lose friendships and you drift from those people as a result. These are not things that I'd considered when I went on this journey.
Fine. So now we've talked about, and you kind of brought it up yourself, about next steps. It's very different for a clinical career where the trajectory is very linear. Foundation training, specialty training, CCT, life post CCT. So now you've been doing patchwork, you said 7 to 8 years. What's next on this path for Dr. Jing Ouyang?
So I think what's nice about business is that there's no ceiling, right? There's always more you can do. You can always launch new products. You can always enter new territories, new markets, new geographies. So I always thought it surprising when my peers would race to become a consultant. And then they're essentially a consultant in their mid-30s, let's say. And then the question is, well, what next now? You've worked all your life on this conveyor belt, and then you've reached what is a very defined endpoint. I imagine there must be an identity crisis of well, is there more to life than just this? Whereas I think on the flip side in business, there's always more things you can pursue. And I think your identity is, as a founder, is inextricably tied with the business itself. So as the business grows, evolves, matures, you're also growing, maturing, and evolving, which is quite nice. But I suppose specifically for me and my role, I'm actually changing my role in the new year. So I mentioned that I started off as the Chief Operating Officer. And it's one of those funny decisions that at the start of a business, you kind of just say, well, what are you going to do, Anas? Well, I guess I'm going to be the CEO. Well, Jing, you might as well be the COO, whatever that means. And both Anas and I have grown and developed our skills and been molded by those roles over the years. But I think we're at a stage of the business now where a change is warranted. And this is something that Anas and I have been discussing for a year because it is a big deal for a founder to change their role. So I'm going to be moving from the Chief Operating Officer role into the CGO role, which is Chief Growth Officer. And I think in making that decision, we thought about, well, where do my skills lie? Where do my passions lie? And what does the business need? So in terms of my skills, I really enjoy the sales aspect of it and working with the clients. And I think this allows me to double down a bit more into those areas that, that I find rewarding and what the business needs as well, especially as we move into the late stage of the business where we will be pursuing more international opportunities. We will be looking at more strategic partnerships. So I think this all aligns nicely with the stage of the business, with our growth as founders, with reflections on what it means to be a founder versus an executive. And so I've been on that journey over the past few months, and that is culminating in me transitioning into this new role in the new year with a new Chief Operating Officer also joining as well. So I think that's something, really exciting to look forward to. Because I've been a COO for the past 8 years. And whilst every year and every month looks different, because the business changes, I think it'll be really interesting for me to have a completely different remit. So I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. And congratulations on your new role. Now, one thing we like to do on the Out of Program podcast is ask the person we're interviewing or guest for a book recommendation. It can be fiction, non-fiction, but based upon your own story, was there something that you read or came across that just resonated with you that you think would really help the audience listening?
Yeah. So I think if I was to come up with a book recommendation, it would be The Almanac of Naval Ravikant. So this book is based on a series of tweets and essays that were written mostly on Twitter or X.com by Naval over the years, in which he shares his wisdom about life, wealth, relationships, business, that have been all culminated and compiled into quite a short book, but it's a book that really delivers a punch. So Naval is a founder. He is the founder of AngelList, and now he's an investor, and of course he's got a portfolio career. But he's very philosophical in the way that he thinks about life and business. And a lot of that wisdom he's communicated through pithy tweets that have then been distilled into this book. And when I read it many years ago, it really changed my perspective on life and on business. So, for example, he talks about wealth creation. He talks about leverage. And he talks about values and how values then tie into your life and tie into business as well, about creating wealth, creating value, and about investing in long-term relationships. I certainly won't do it justice describing it, and I highly recommend you all read it, because it was very formative for me, and it really did change my perspective about business and life as well.
Now, talking about Naval, what we'll do is we'll put a link to the book in the description for this episode, but just to add into that, because it's like a gem, like a diamond in the rough, is his, he's done this video where he goes through his quite notorious tweet that got a lot of traction, how to get rich. Is this clickbait? He admits it himself. It was a clickbait title, but he talks about these fundamental principles. What is wealth? What is leverage? What is the meaning of like a good life? What you should focus on. Talks about like status games and how to avoid these type of things. And I think for medics, like we are so illiterate in these domains. It's something like finance. Most medics don't understand their payslip, let alone like how to navigate their trajectory, go on a out of program type of career path. So if we'll put the link to that video in the podcast description as well. But please, Naval, he's definitely like up there for me as well. So thank you again, Jing. Like it's really been fascinating to hear your side of the story in terms of your trajectory, getting into medical school, having this type of like identity crisis. Am I that academic? Or is there more that I can add to my arsenal of skills and character? Understanding the hustle of Imperial, and I'm sure it's still hustling and bustling even to this day. I don't think that's changed at all. And then having these type of like touch points in foundation program that were just nudging you into that final leap into this career of business and co-founding Patchwork with Anna. So thank you again for your time. For those of you listening, if you're on YouTube, please like and subscribe, notification bell on. We're getting used to it. Still haven't figured it out, but we'll get there eventually. If you're listening to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, please also subscribe. We've got some amazing guests lined up for this new year. We can't wait to share their journeys of going out of program with you. And if there's any comments or any guests that you would like us to interview, please do share them. All feedback is really appreciated. And we'll see you on the next episode. Take care, everyone.